So I want to now talk a little bit though about some of the limits archaeology has. So we've talked a lot about the strengths archaeology has, and we've talked a bit about the narrative that archaeology gives us of hominin evolution over time, which is fascinating and really cool. At the same time, like any other science, archaeology is one where there are limitations. And so let's talk a bit of those. Yes, it's like opening up a treasure box, but also it's not quite like opening up a treasure box, because that would be simple, right? You just lift up the treasure box, and assuming it's not like cursed by a pirate ghost or something, you've got yourself some nice treasure. By contrast, archaeology is probably better compared to a puzzle where a bunch of the pieces are missing and where we don't have the picture ahead of time. So I've kind of got this here where I was working on. This isn't like a puzzle for adults. This is like my son's puzzle. Obviously, I don't like sit at home and do, a puzzle that's this basic. I do a puzzle that has at least 50 pieces. Anyways, in this puzzle, you see that there's huge missing parts, and then you've also got a couple of pieces that you're like, where the heck do these even go? I'm not sure. They don't connect to any of the other things. And that's kind of like what the archaeological record is like sometimes. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I've got a funnel here. I don't know why I was blanking on the word funnel, probably because it's late. And the top, I've got, human past. You can tell that I discovered my touchscreen today and was having a lot of fun with it on this computer that I have from work, that I was like, oh, I can draw things on my PowerPoint slides. Anyways, it says human past. And so that would be sort of all the different things humans were up to back in the day. And then I've got here down at the very bottom, sites we find. And what I'm trying to represent with that is that the archaeological record, the things that we find and are able to analyze and are able to shape our understanding of the human and hominin past, is only a sliver of what happened in the past. And there's a huge gap between what happened and what we ever find and actually analyze. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. First of all, there's data limitations. And there's several data limitations. One of the first of which is there wasn't that much to begin with. And let me explain what I mean by that. The earliest hominins, things like Homo habilis and later Homo erectus and then even early Homo sapiens, were all hunter-gatherers, okay, as far as we can tell. They were small groups, right? So we have to estimate this partly based on the archaeological site and partly based on modern hunter-gatherer groups, and we would estimate that groups were generally, 50 or less. So they were small. They were mobile. They probably would have had to move around in most cases to have access to types of food they were eating, since animals that they're hunting move around, and sometimes plants go in and out of season depending on where you are, and different plants are available in different places at different times, so they would have been mobile. That doesn't mean they didn't ever stay in one place for a while, but they would have been moving around relatively often. They were small, and they were hunter-gatherers, so they weren't exactly lugging around big screen TVs to leave in the record, or even creating things generally like pyramids or something. That's, there are exceptions to that, but generally speaking, hunter-gatherer groups leave behind fewer material remains than other groups because they're not developing these huge sort of cities with all these easy to find ruins, so it's harder to find. There was also just a much smaller population of early humans than modern humans, right? We have 7 billion people now versus, we would have had fewer than 100,000 at early times. So the conditions under which archaeological sites happen are specific types of condition. It doesn't always happen that a site gets well preserved, especially when you're working with things like, or like fur clothing that decays really easily, right? So a lot of things just would have decayed, and a lot of the stuff even that was left, there wasn't that much of it left because the population densities were low. And even of the stuff that was left, some of it's kind of hard to interpret because if it's stone tools, sometimes it can be hard to tell if a stone is really a tool or just kind of got chipped in funny ways. I'm being not very scientific in how I'm describing it, but that's basically the question. So there's not that much to work with to begin with. And then, unfortunately, most of the sites or artifacts have been destroyed already just by natural processes, right? The world doesn't look like the world did 2 million years ago. Areas that were once human inhabited or hominin inhabited rather, are now flooded. Some of them have been covered, in ways by different types of soil or things where they might be inaccessible. So a lot of sites and artifacts just are not accessible to us. They're not near the surface of the soil. They may even be covered by water or different things, or have been destroyed in different ways. And then you have the fact that modern humans are destroying archaeological sites all the time. We try to do things to prevent this. So, for example, here in the United States, we have a variety of laws, such as the Archaeological Resource Protection Act, and other types of laws, which say, among other things, that basically when something like a huge highway is being put in, that we're going to send an archaeologist to kind of like look at the site first and see if there's like clear evidence that there's an archaeological site under there, and then they dig it up really quick and try to analyze it as best as they can. And we call that CRM, Cultural Resource Management, or sometimes contract archaeology, and it's actually a field that employs a lot of our anthropologists. And that kind of work's important because otherwise that stuff would just be entirely lost. It's losing pieces of history, so to speak, when we put in a highway or put in a huge government building. So we do that kind of stuff to make sure that we're not losing history. But there's a whole lot of, land that we either never did that for before we laid down concrete and put a building there, or we did do it there, but we might not have caught what was there because, there wasn't any like obvious artifacts on the surface. And so because of that, there's a whole bunch of sites that now have concrete on top of them, or otherwise have something human on top of them. And unless we plan to dig underneath all the concrete in the world, we're never going to find those archaeological sites anytime soon. Now, it's not always depressing if you're concerned, like, oh man, we're never going to find anything archaeologically. Sometimes we make major breakthroughs. For example, there's recently been new radar developed where you can like basically use a plane or a drone, go over the rainforest in Central America, do like this radar thing, and then through that we've been able to find that there's a whole bunch of Mayan sites that we never would have found otherwise underneath the rainforest. So that's really cool. But the fact of the matter is the vast majority of sites and artifacts are already destroyed and or are currently destroyed and or they have something on top of them. So what we're seeing when we excavate sites is a fraction of what actually happened way back in the day. So we're missing puzzle pieces. That's true of a lot of sciences, honestly. There's a lot of sciences where we're missing puzzle pieces. In astronomy, we're certainly missing all sorts of puzzles. Even in things like human genetics, right? There's still tremendous amount we don't understand. So we're missing puzzle pieces, and that makes it hard. There's other kinds of limitations as well. So I want you to think for a second, maybe pause the video and write down. I want you to think about archaeology and then ask yourself, what are archaeologists working with? And they're working with artifacts, stone tools that were left behind. If a settlement was made, like here on the Kenai Peninsula, right, things like home depressions, where there was obviously houses back in the day because you can still see the like depressions in the ground. So we're working with artifacts. We're working in places where we're working with things where the land was really obviously modified by earlier human groups. Things of that nature. Sometimes maybe we're doing soil testing to figure out where humans were doing things like farming. But I want you to think about what would be the limits of artifacts and those types of things. Like what kinds of things could you tell from them and what kinds of things couldn't you tell from them? And as your book alludes to, and as you might realize, some things are pretty clear from artifacts, right? We have a pretty good sense, for example, of what Homo erectus was probably eating based on the types of tools they were using and the types of bodies they had, right? And the types of environment they were in. And, human groups that lived 15,000 years ago, we can look at the artifacts, look at the types of technologies, say, well, they've got a bunch of arrowheads but no farming technology, and say, well, they're clearly a hunter-gatherer group. And we can even probably interpret what kind of a hunter-gatherer group. And if we can find sites with animal bones and things, then we have a pretty good idea what they were eating. What kinds of things, though, would be hard to interpret from artifacts? So technology, food, what houses look like, all of that stuff's pretty easy, assuming you can find the sites. But what kinds of things would be hard? Well, religious beliefs, for one. How do you tell what counts as a religious object and what's just another stone tool? For all we know, these sexy hand axes were actually sacred hand axes that had some kind of religious value, and we just really don't know because we can't take a time machine and go ask Acheulean toolmakers what they were thinking. since we don't have time machines, the further back in history you go, the less likely it is that the culture or oral tradition has been passed down, and the more likely that it is that all we're working with is an artifact. And once you go back far, especially because if you go back far enough, you don't have writing, right? Before, give or take 8 to 10,000 years ago. And so before writing, and you're only working with an artifact, and it's been enough time that nobody sort of remembers that time period, it's a lot of speculation to try to figure out what was going on with these objects. So things like religious beliefs, things like are really hard to interpret. And then there's kind of mid-level things like social status or like how families were set up, that aren't maybe quite as hard as religious beliefs to try to figure out from the record, but are pretty tricky still to figure out from the record. So there's a lot that is hard to tell, and we have to do interpretation, and our interpretation may or may not be right. The Venus figurines that you read about are really good examples. So basically, in this time period of sort of, 35,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago kind of thing, or before, sorry, it would be more like 37,000 years ago because it's BCE, so before Christ, before Common Era. Anyways, these Venus figurines, you find them all across Europe, and this is kind of the most stereotypical one that you'll see a lot if you do research on this topic, although they actually had a lot of variety, and some of them are not even necessarily female figurines. But generally speaking, when we talk about the female or the Venus figurines, what we have is small, like very small, like handheld statues of what appear to be women, and it's particularly what appear to be women with exaggerated bodily features, very large breasts, a larger stomach, stuff like this. And so what were these? We find them all across Europe during a certain time period, and what in the world were people doing? You could come up with a number of different theories, and people have. Some people think that they're basically prehistoric dolls that, like something small children would have played with, right? Barbie, but for Paleolithic people. Some people believe they were women's self-portraits, particularly pregnant women, looking down at their own bodies and then sort of carving out what they saw, before modern mirrors or something. Some people feel like these were religious objects and involved in worship of goddesses. Some people feel, and when I say some people, I mean archaeologists even disagree on this. Some people feel that these were sexual images used for arousal. What were they? We really don't know, right? It's hard to interpret meaning when we don't have the original artists and people that were using these artifacts to go back and interview. So some things will just sort of, at least until we invent time machines, be up to our interpretation in the archaeological record. That's also one of the reasons why we don't really know when things like religious beliefs started. This is a big topic of interest for me since I'm an anthropologist of religion. Some of the earliest purported sites of religiosity, aka some of the earliest sites that some archaeologists claim are sites of early religious activity by, for example, Neanderthals, involve basically burials. So as your book talked about, the example of sort of like a burial that's done in a really remote cave from tens of thousands of years ago. Early Neanderthal burials, some people feel as if they may have religious connotations, because why else would you be putting a dead body like way back in a cave that was hard to get to? In this like super random remote spot, or in another example of an early burial, why would you be burying people with flower petals on top of them, kind of positioned in a weird, funky way? Clearly, this was some kind of death ritual to secure them a place in the afterlife. To which I would respond, maybe. I mean, maybe, right? I'm not sure that logic fully holds. Atheists still put flowers on grave sites, right? People decorate and commemorate the dead, whether or not they're religious or have some kind of a sense of the afterlife. And so I'm not sure the logic fully holds that just because something special was done with dead relatives, that automatically means Neanderthals were engaging in religious behavior. So it's unclear from the archaeological record in that regard when exactly religious behavior shows up within hominins or modern Homo sapiens. And that's a good example of a broader trend of just the things we can't tell for certain from artifacts.